Hello, MB Poli world, and thank you again for coming back to another week here on the MB Poli Pod. We are back this week here in Mennequist in St. John, New Brunswick, on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, the Wolastoq, and the Pescatoma Cardy. I am here. We're excited about our interview this week with Mr. Dominic Cardy, the leader of a new national party, which we'll talk about, as well as an independent member of the New Brunswick legislature. And as always, we want to practice that discipline of political banter, which doesn't happen a lot in New Brunswick. And people have a misunderstanding about how interesting New Brunswick politics is, the topics and what's behind the curtain of all the government pieces and things like that. But before I do that, I have been remiss. The last podcast, I did not thank our supporters. So I want to take a few seconds to do that. Just bring up our Patreon supporters. As always, you can find us. Let me put up our little banner there. You can support the podcast if you like what we're doing by going to the MB Poli Pod site on Patreon. A special shout out goes to our politicos, Mark Brewer, as well as Sean Rose, as well as Fred LaForge, longtime supporters of ours, really helping keep us in the loop of different things going on with good perspective, but also our supporters, Jackson Jones, Luke Robertson, as well as, who am I missing here? There's one more, Patrick Hennessy. So thank you to all of you. And there's a number of you who are other supporters just looking to keep in the loop with us. Thank you for coming to Patreon and checking us out. You can always give, helps, keeps us ad free. Hate ads, don't want to go there. So we always love that support. Keep us going, keep the subscription services and all that, and the streaming service by StreamYard paid for. So thank you for that. Now, without further ado, I am going to bring in Mr. Dominic Cardy. Mr. Cardy, welcome to the show.
Hey, please call me just Dominic, and good to be on the show. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So we've got a lot to talk about, and we're, like I said to you at the top when we were just sort of preambling here, just chatting about the show, we have been looking for, some, what I would call a sensible conservative. There's many of them that we'll talk to online back and forth. And, we've asked a number of different people over time, including, Andrea Mason. We've asked a few others in government to come on the show, and most people are open to it. We can never get around to the schedule, and I get that's hard. That's certainly Andrew's experience. So you're really our first, not going to say our first conservative. We have other guests. I mean, we had a conservative, a former cabinet minister, come on the show from Alberta and give us a really interesting, his name is Doug Griffiths, take on that connection piece. So you're not our first conservative, but we'd love to have somebody that we can circle back to, sort of like we do with Sean Rouse, who gives us a different perspective on issues. But I think what would be great for the audience is just to catch us up a little bit. You've been really active. You've made some national news attention. You've started a new party, or you're part of the new party, you're interim leader. Tell us a little bit about that and this dovetail with the provincial experience that you've had from government now to be an independent.
Sure. Thanks for that chance. So, first off, I'd say that if you're looking for a conservative voice, I might not be your best choice, because the areas which people would identify me as being left and others right. And that gets to my pretty core political philosophy that I've had since I was in my 20s, which is that the left-right dichotomy is functionally meaningless, that you've got to be an idiot to think that the government can run everything, and you've got to be an idiot to think that the government shouldn't run anything and it should all be left to the private sector. Mm-hmm. I think that we have one of the reasons our politics is so screwed up at the moment is that we keep on sticking to this old dichotomy that came from the French Revolution that in no way reflects modern reality, and that anyone who isn't functionally deranged believes in a mixed economy where you've got a private sector that generates wealth, which has been generally shown and through experience of different countries in different parts of the world, that the private sector can make money, but government needs to be there to provide common services that are both more efficiently provided by government and help to make sure that people who are born year on year on year have access to a more equal life and the ability to compete without having to push up against enormous wealthy vested interests all the time. They're still there, of course. But anyway, so I don't know. So I definitely wouldn't describe myself as conservative. I certainly like the tradition in New Brunswick, but I was always I'd spent decades in the New Democratic Party as someone who was seen as being on the right of that party. So you can call me a right-wing NDP or a left-wing conservative. I just prefer a Canadian who cares about what's happening with my country. And back to your question around the new federal party, I don't see anyone out there telling the truth about what's actually happening in this country right now. And that's why there's this group who've come together around the Canadian Future Party. We've got former NDP MPs, former Harper cabinet ministers, a range of people who've got interesting political backgrounds who are looking at their current or now former political home and going, is this really what we need right now? Justin Trudeau, who spends his time apologizing for things that happened a long time ago without doing much in the way of taking concrete steps to actually fix problems, thinking about the fact that so many First Nations still don't have water they can drink. The fact that we are seeing endless government social programs rolled out with very little follow through and insufficient funding. Hope we get a chance to talk a little bit about early childhood education.
Yes.
I think a positive step this week between the feds and the provincial Tories, where I think there was a really good news announcement, but still it's like pulling teeth with the feds. They want to put out press releases and more press releases, but when it comes to actually following up and creating stable, long-term sustainable programs that'll make life better for Canadians, I don't seem quite as interested in that, more interested in scoring political points, which is easy when you've got an opposition like Mr. Poilievre's Conservatives, who just seem to be taking watered down versions of Mr. Trump's playbook and rolling those out in Canada. I get why he's doing that. He's plugged his party into the online social media algorithm-driven world that generates him enormous numbers of clicks and impressions because he rides in the coattails of the MAGA movement. The fact that that's a dangerous movement that would seriously threaten Canada's ability to survive as an independent functioning state, we don't spend any time talking about that. So my goal with the new party is we say not left, not right, but forward. Let's use evidence to come up with solutions. Let's have a conversation about what democracy means again, because I think that we're seeing that under attack around the world, and it's being eroded partly by extremists, but partly by our own complacency, because we live in this world of unparalleled luxury and wealth compared to any point in human history, despite our enduring problems with poverty and exclusion. Those are all in the context of a world that's become vastly more fair and equal and just in countries like Canada. And we still, though, live in a world of inequality where huge numbers of people don't have access to our democratic rights or to our economic wealth. So how do we make a better world? So a better world based on evidence with a strong bias towards democracy and making sure we stand up and fight for democracy so that the next generation that comes along can continue to have their conversations about how to improve an imperfect project like Canada, an imperfect project like democracy.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there. I would definitely want to circle back to a couple of those points. But just to kind of dovetail that with the provincial experience, you're sitting as an independent. You obviously, I mean, what I've called it on this podcast in the past was basically chucking a grenade, in Premier Higgs's office on your way out, with just revealing that there was such a diametric problem of leadership, or a diametric problem with the way of the approach of the Premier's office on some issues that, not long after that, we saw MLA Dorothy Shepherd come out with her own letter, which dated things back a long time. And we've seen, an exodus. I don't know. I could be stand to be corrected, but I don't think we've ever seen an exodus of incumbent sitting MLAs who are deciding, not to reoffer for government like we have seen during, outside of the writ dropping. Usually there's a number that come out last minute in the last 3 months or so and says, hey, I'm not running this time. But, this has been year 2, year 3 into their mandate.
Yeah, it's quite bizarre that we've got a large number. I'm aware of at least 6 current Tory MLAs who will not vote Conservative in October. And that says a lot, in addition to the other folks who've decided not to run again or to leave, and who have done it as well, like you said, not by just saying, yeah, that's my time is past, or I need to spend more time with my family, the usual reasons the politicians try and quietly bow out. A lot of people making it really clear that they do not like the direction that Mr. Higgs is taking the province. And I think that for me, this has all been an interesting ride. I was leader of the NDP for years and had quite a lot of influence over the government of David Alward, who was in from 2010 to 14. Got some legislation passed despite having no seats in the legislature, working with the then Premier and with the then Finance Minister Higgs. the fact that we shifted from having reformers, like Mr. Higgs was seen as being a reformer inside his party, shift his focus from managing programs and delivering results, which was very much his focus when he won the leadership. There was an open pledge to progressives inside the Progressive Conservative Party that he wouldn't go down a socially conservative road. The fact that he felt comfortable to break that commitment and to slide down the rather depressing, dark rabbit hole of social conservatism that we've seen him embrace in the last couple of years is a sign, I think, of a broader political shift happening across Canada and across the West, where people who felt that their bigoted, reprehensible views were unacceptable, and even if they still held them, that they would never admit them publicly, now feel quite comfortable expressing those. And we're seeing that on the left and right, with the astonishing increase in anti-Semitic statements by people on the left and right fringes, the embrace of extreme ideas and nonsense politics and conspiracies that didn't have any mainstream purchase even, say, 10, 15 years ago. But again, that online world of social media algorithms that drives engagement to be more and more extreme, more and more divisive, and the facts be damned. The premier had a choice, and he decided to hop onto that bandwagon. And we're seeing a party in the form of the PCs that was broadly socially progressive, not downtown Toronto's progressive, but
Sure.
This was a party that has long embraced bilingualism, multiculturalism, lots of progressive ideas. And to suddenly see those be sidelined and policies be reversed by a premier who didn't even have the support of his cabinet, forget about his cabinet, to make those changes, is a sign of the weakness of political parties, which is something else that scares me, because parties no longer are really listening to engaged activists connected to communities. They're bypassing all that and going straight to the public through social media, an incredible communications tool, but one that is much more suited to demagogues and dictators than for democratic engagement, as much as it's attempting sort of addiction for anyone to fall in wherever they are in the spectrum. And we've certainly seen left leaders falling into the same trap that the right-wing leaders have, because it's easier. And in a world where everyone's online, it's easier to get people excited with online division than it is to get them to come out to a coffee shop or to actually engage in real frontline politics.
Yeah.
So
it's like it's lazy democracy, it's
lazy democracy and effective autocracy. And that's part of the problem.
Yeah, it's baffling to me with Premier Higgs that there has been this real ornery sense to him. I've been trying to gauge that and figure out where it comes from. Certainly, Steve Outhouse's track record with Ford and Danielle Smith in Alberta tended to be to really, and I think we're seeing that tactic play out right now. It tends to be hide them, put them in the basement, get them out of the public perception for a while. The news cycle's too fast. Everybody will forget about this problem. But you've got a really entrenched, unpopular sort of perspective that keeps coming up, poll after poll about Higgs and New Brunswick's leadership in general on a number of issues that I don't think can be escaped. And so to me, it's like, where do you think Higgs gets this stubbornness, this I don't care? Because Doug Ford doesn't have it. Like, Doug Ford will come out and be a little bit of the, I gave it my best, guys, I'll do better next time kind of approach, right? And a lot of people sort of resonate with that, and they're willing to forgive Doug for it. There, I know that other commentators, like not Corey Tonight, but certainly Scott Reed on Cursive Politics, have commented on, he has this a little bit like every man. He's just a little average Joe who made a mistake, and he's kind of a bumbling fool up there, and people are like, it's just Doug, and they're willing to come back, even though at one point he was in Higgs's category of the most unpopular leader in the country. But Higgs has not done anything to sort of take that line, and I don't know where it comes from.
Well, I think a lot of stuff in the core of any politician's personality, you would hope, is actually going to be their real personality. And obviously you mediate that and try and polish off the rough edges, because it's a job like sales or anything else where you're connecting to the public, that you've got to make sure that you're appealing. So I think Doug Ford has a big advantage, having met him a bunch of times, that he's actually a nice guy. And you might like him, might not like his politics, but he is, I think, trying to generally do his best. Again, some of the issues that his government have had, I would be in support of, and some totally against. But he's still, I think, and I would always hesitate to call someone who's won 2 majority governments in Canada's largest province a bumbling fool.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
he's got. You could put him on a stage with Tim Walz, to take a recent example of sort of an everyman sort of dad figure, right? And they would get on fine.
Yeah, that's a good point. But Higgs doesn't have that.
Blaine Higgs does not have that. So you mentioned Mr. Outhouse's work with the 4 team, and Danielle Smith and Leslyn Lewis are much more the campaigns that have clearly inspired Blaine Higgs's direction. And I think the direction that our premier was taking before he hired Mr. Outhouse was clear. Mr. Outhouse being brought on board, I don't think has helped particularly so far, despite he's certainly a smart and competent comms professional. Although I do have to note yesterday, because my wife pointed it out, that the Tories putting out an ad talking about hydro rates going up. It's like, guys, it's MP power, not hydro. Like, come on, like don't. Yeah.
Let's avoid amateur hour here.
The upper Canadianisms in there. That is sloppy comms. But anyway, but I think the premier is stubborn, and that's a common feature in politics, and I'm certainly guilty of that. Lots of people who do well in politics have that as a personality trait. But he, because the party structure is so weak, has been able to fall into the trap of believing what he wants to hear more and more. And I don't blame him for that. That is, as a person, because that is a broader problem in our democracies, that the longer people are in office, the fewer people they listen to, the more likely they are to believe their own ideas. My favorite example of how politicians sort of drink their own bathwater is Chairman Mao, who, when he was a young man, wrote a book. He wrote a book against the dangers of cults of personality. And then a couple of decades later, he's got hundreds of millions of copies of the Little Red Book being forced on people. And if you don't quote him and talk about how wonderful he is every day, you could get killed. So this is the same guy who swung from having feelings that were strong enough to write a book to feeling strong enough to write another book. So this is a natural tendency in humans that, especially when you've got power, that you don't want to give it up. And you increasingly think that you're right, and you increasingly get irritated with people who tell you you're wrong, in part because if you've been successful, you've got some evidence to say, well, who are these guys?
The evidence bias kicks in, right? Well, it works, so it's going to work forever. And that's
a huge problem. And that's something that used to be mitigated by political parties. And it's something that in Canada, we're really bad at, because we have the British Westminster system. But one of the greatest, if we talk about something that Mr. Trudeau should apologize for, it was the post-Confederation move by Liberal and Conservative parties to centralize massive power in the hands of the party leader. That you look at the British Parliament today, and you have got Labour MPs who never vote with the government. Jeremy Corbyn, their former leader, when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were leaders of his party, he voted against them. I think it was 600 times. No consequence. Right. That was
so. There was not as strong as a whip vote under the leader's office as there was in Canada.
Different. Here we don't have a whip system. That here every single vote is whipped, full stop. Right. And so the expectation is that everyone, from the deputy premier, prime minister, whoever, down to the lowest backbencher, everyone will vote for the government, full stop on everything all the time. And if you don't, you get kicked out of caucus. In the UK, every vote is a challenge for the leadership, whether you're in government or in opposition. You've got to go and build consensus in your team. So you've got to use your whip's offices. The British parliamentary caucuses have many, many, many different whips, each one of them responsible for a fairly small number of MPs, because their job is to listen to the backbenchers. And find out, okay, this is not going to work because of these regional issues, or these guys are so grumpy about something else that we're going to need to talk to them to smooth that over before we can move in this direction. So it makes politics a lot more genuinely democratic, because rather than having one person who controls a voting block that's determined every 4 years, you've got a constant, day by day, bill by bill, shifting and moving of the political currents. And that gives people who have a vote in parliaments more power. So just with that change, you would have seen in New Brunswick, the premier exposed to forces that he would have had to respond to. So it's the fact that we have structures that allow our leaders to ignore their teams, and parties that we've already just mentioned have kind of atrophied and have been replaced with online engagement tools rather than face-to-face grassroots political organizing. So those two weaknesses, one longstanding in the way we run our parliaments, and the other more recent in the way parties have themselves atrophied, those both contribute to making the sort of leadership that we see from our current premier that much worse. You take people's worst traits and you encourage them. We have structures that we could easily adopt that would help push back against that. And ironically, this premier used those in 2018 to 2020.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I agree, in my observations, when I came online in 2020 to run for the Greens here in Harbor, last minute, I was swinging a hammer full time. I, had interest in the party, had done some work with Wayne Dreyer here on the ground, was really frustrated with both other parties. And when I started to organize, I was baffled at how poor the ground game was, for the other parties. So I think, when you say the other, like, we have such a weak political party system, it does seem to be the case that there is not a lot of entrenched party infrastructure. It just seems to get whipped up last minute. And, last year when I was approached, but also saw others approached by Susan Holt's leadership team, not to name names or to, call them out, but I was pretty baffled at how uninformed the folks were that were going around trying to recruit candidates, especially younger candidates, which I think is something Susan has really struggled with. She struggled to get women to run for her, and she's struggled to get young people and more diverse candidates to get engaged. And it strikes me that what you're saying is true. That is because those parties have just, they've avoided the hard work of building the party infrastructure and the base and the people into something, and have just gone for that quick fix, that quick hit of comms tools. I don't know if that's everything that you're saying, but that's sort of what my observation would be in some of that.
Well, it is, because it reflects the fact that increasingly parties are leader driven. And you see that with the Conservative Party, where there was an effort to push Premier Higgs to a leadership review, and his ability to control the party machine, including having the party secretary, executive director working as a staffer who he had direct influence over. That you don't have the parties able to operate as independent vehicles to preserve a party's values and traditions as they carry forward. Ultimately, all these are just human inventions. Some parties are similar to religions, right? It's the same stuff. It's all just humans looking for an existential belief package and then a tool to be able to mobilize them to achieve those goals. And we've seen a huge decline over the last 20, 30 years in organized mass politics. And that's so on the one hand, though, it is also easy to, as we're both doing, to say that this is bad. It's incredibly difficult to push back against that, because partly everyone is online all the time. People don't want to go out to meetings with people they don't know. That there is a general atomization of society as we've replaced face-to-face organizing and work with people who live near us with very transitory, transnational online of people who we identify with more. And that ability for the online world to replace structure and organization in real life is incredibly hard to push back against. And linking back to the new party I'm involved with, one of the things we're trying to do is, how can we recapture that essential human activity of face-to-face confrontation, debate, and building to create a political structure that can actually make life better for people in a world where people's attention span has dropped down below, depending on which study you're looking at, certainly below 2 minutes. There's been a total collapse in our ability to pay attention to things. And when you're talking about how do we reform healthcare to make sure it remains accessible, or it becomes accessible again and remains affordable, that's not something you can deal with in 30 seconds. So this is an enormous sort of species-wide challenge that everyone around the world is facing who's engaged in democratic politics. And we are just as stunned as the adults as the kids are in school, and having debates about cell phone policies in schools. One of the reasons we need to get cell phones out of schools is because the people who are running the classrooms and running the schools are as addicted to this tech as everyone else. And we have no idea how to control that addiction or what real impact it's having on our species and on us as individuals. The growing evidence is quite worrying, but it's still all very new. And so democracy is always, political stability is always most challenged by periods of mass change in communications. You look at the invention of the printing press, which led to religious wars across Europe for hundreds of years. The invention of radio and film that many would argue contributed to the rise of communism and fascism as 20th century authoritarian movements because of that earlier ability, again, for leaders to be able to speak directly to a public. And now the internet has taken us so far beyond what those technologies of even 40 years ago could have achieved in terms of influence. And we have no idea what it's doing to us. It's rewiring our brains, rewiring our social structures and our organizational structures. And we have no clue really about how, and are only just beginning to think about how, even though this is easy, maybe this is bad, maybe we should try and be working on some sort of conscious alternative to make sure we can preserve some of the fantastic successes of face-to-face political organizing that led to small L liberal democracy, that led us to have the ability to chat here today without worrying too much about government censorship or the cost of the internet fees or the other things that most people in the world today still have to worry about.
Right. And you're making a point that I think Donald Savoy brought up, which was like trying to grab. I think part of the problem, and I know George Monbiot talks about this a little bit in his book Out of the Wreckage, which is about kind of creating this politics of belonging, which you're alluding to and speaking directly to in many ways. But I think of that point that the more power that is sort of invested in a detached, disjointed system. So you think of Ottawa, you think of even Fredericton to some, the less that exists at that local level, the more it's trying to, when you're thinking about these issues, when you're thinking about healthcare, when you're thinking about international diplomacy, or when you're thinking about, federal level stuff, it's trying to grab smoke, to use his analogy directly. And when people can pick up their phone and get an inspirational sort of Kamala Harris punch or, a Bernie Sanders or a Donald Trump, that's tangible. It's right there. It's in their hands. They feel like they have control when they can be part of a team that has a narrative about what's, you talked about sort of these unifying field theories about, well, this is my camp. I believe in flat earth. I'm a MAGA conservative. I believe in whatever. It's like, okay, well, I have a place where I belong. And that's really the essence that we're looking for at the very human level, is where do we belong? And I wonder if it's like, as you're talking through this, I wonder if there doesn't need to be a real concerted, like ideologically, whether it's reasonable or possible politically is another question, but ideologically to move toward that, okay, we do need to take more of that Swiss model where there is, referendum opportunity on specific legislation if the local community gathers to do it. They have like 12 referendums a year in some cases, which is incredibly expensive. There's no question. But they also have really high voter turnout. They have high social cohesion. Sure, they can still be racist and put up, anti mosque legislation, right? Like any community has its faults. But I look at these different models. You talk about England and, we see the States to us. It's like, where is that sort of hopeful example? And maybe where would you say it is? Like when you see sort of a hopeful situation for the species that they're like, okay, they're doing something right there. What would you look to?
There are not very many examples today. And I think that the Swiss example is an interesting one, because one of the reasons that I don't think more direct democracy right now would work is that in addition to having this new technology, we also have the countries and groups that Anne Applebaum talked about in her most recent book, Autocracy, Inc., which I'd strongly recommend. It's a short book, really does a good job of describing the forces that are arrayed against any sort of movement for a better world that I think you and I would ultimately be on the same side on. Right? You've got Russians, Chinese, Iranians, the Russians and Chinese being much better at it, who are intentionally trying to create division in democracies using the tools that they deny access to their own citizens, the use of, because they are openly saying that they're at war with us and want to destroy the unipolar world, which of course is what they mean is the world based on universal human rights, on the idea of a better world. And they use the absolutely, in many cases, shameful history of the US and other democracies and sins of colonialism and imperialism. But they've managed to weaponize those against us to the point that we don't have much of a coherent or positive cultural response, despite the fact that we are the people, our culture, our civilization, with people from around the world of all colors who love all people of different faiths, are the ones who built a world that recognized gay rights in a structured way for the first time, talked about multiculturalism, and embedded that into our legal structures. And it's moving imperfectly towards making something that is absolutely imperfect, Canada, better. And the problem we've got is, so this new technology is coming along with these very direct attacks on that democracy. And what makes me reluctant to give any positive examples is I think that the West is still suffering from a collective, and I say West, I mean the broad liberal democratic world, so obviously includes Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, other places.
Right.
That are not geographically in the West, but broadly hold on to the idea of an open society as being the ideal. That we are at a moment of real vulnerability because we've invented this technology, which could only have been invented and shared with the public in a democracy. Because I don't think if the North Koreans had invented the internet, they would have given it to their citizens to access cat videos.
Well, we certainly know the monarchs of Europe and the printing press had their issues and burning them down and all that stuff. Yeah.
So the fact that we've got the governments that are structurally biased towards how much freedom do we allow as opposed to how much repression can we get away with, and that people like us have the ability to fuss and complain about it again without generally risking arrest or harassment. Well, I guess I can't say that because I was arrested.
I was just going to say.
Anyway, I'll have to change that line and come back to that. But still broadly, right? That and I'm a privileged middle-aged white guy, so I didn't expect that I was going to get particularly badly treated by the Toronto police. And I've talked to other people since who have had worse experiences doing similar things to what I did when I spoke up against the pro-Hamas folks. But still, all those problems are happening at the same time as our liberal democratic world is going through a crisis of confidence because it was massively successful for a long time. And then we talked about the left-right thing doesn't really make any sense. So you've got the schizophrenia of a right-wing movement that talks about bodily freedom on the one hand to stop vaccines, but totally embraces it when it comes to restricting women's reproductive rights. On the left, we're committed to science, except when it comes to GMO, where for some reason we don't like them, so we pretend that they're bad. So we don't have neither side has got a particularly solid foundation, which makes both sides, in the end, all of us, our whole civilization, incredibly open to outside abuse. And we've got on top of that, this little sort of the icing in the cake is this residual layer of Western racism, where we imagine that people who aren't from the West couldn't possibly be taking over the world, couldn't possibly be replacing our model of votes and trade unions and the imperfect, muddy way that we kind of get things done. You're replacing it with some horrifying medieval absolute monarchy, which is ultimately, regardless of the ideological cloaks they wear, what Mr. Putin and Chairman Xi are talking about. So we're vulnerable, we're complacent, and we're just getting to grips with this technology that we invented and released on the world in a way that was astonishingly uncontrolled, because that is one of the geniuses of our culture, is to be more open like that. But we better wake up to the fact that there is a real risk right now. So if I was going to give one country an answer to your question that's offering me some hope, Ukraine.
Okay.
Ukraine gets invaded by an imperialist power using all the same lines of imperialist expansion and conquest that France, Belgium, the UK, other countries have used. Therefore, we've stopped using it, and they are still using it. And in response to that, Ukraine rallied around the idea of democracy, and rather than excusing their flaws, embraced the idea of the liberal West with a passion that is incredible if you go there and see it, where they have taken action against corruption. They've embraced GLBT rights in a way they never had before, because they actually looked at that package of things that you and I are rightly sometimes cynical about in our home province and country and society across the Western nations of, okay, it's great we're talking about democracy. There's this tiny handful of rich people who are controlling everything. It's great we talk about pluralism, but we've got Elon Musk, who's essentially able to buy his definition of free speech and impose it on the world. We've got flaws and we've got problems, but I think it took a country like Ukraine, that moment of existential threat from a absolutely authoritarian, neo-fascist invader, to go, no, we want this. We want the right to be able to speak freely in the middle of a war, to be able to criticize our government. to arrest business people who are corrupt and undermining the war effort, and to recognize that when we talk about rights, that we better mean that for everyone, and talking about minority protections, including for sexual minorities, that had never been on the agenda before. And similarly, a pushback against online misinformation, where the Ukrainians, I think, have done an astonishingly good job of making their case to the world. This little country trying its best to stand up against a fascist invasion. So I would cite Ukraine as being a rare spot, but it's a pretty dark bright spot when what you look to for inspiration is a country that is under existential risk of being annihilated by a genocidal invader. But I've got every hope that in the end, the spirit of sort of freedom and progress that's driven humanity forward over the last few hundred years will continue, and Ukraine will succeed, and we'll get our mojo back and figure out how to get our politics working properly and continue to make life better for people.
Yeah, I do kind of, I hoped the same thing. I guess the long time I've been very frustrated with just how sleepy people are about some of the problems. I got into a bit of a not a disagreement. I'd say that Mr. Savoy convinced me to think a little bit differently about our billionaire crowd, or to at least acknowledge that there is a coherent way of thinking about them differently. But I still look at that and I think, my reducing it down to the simplest issue, a lot of people have been fine for a long time, it seems to me, with the fact that things have been getting, quality of life has been diminishing, that our future potential has been diminishing. I'm 35. So when my old man worked a summer job at Point Lepreau with no education and no trade history, but as on a construction team, a summer's job meant he could go on to the lot in 1974 and buy a new car, right? I couldn't work for 5 years and save every penny, after I pay for my housing and everything else and afford to buy a car, even without driving one, right? Like it's this sort of framework, when I was a kid, even healthcare wait times were 2-3 hours. I had an outpatients clinic in Blacks where I grew up that I could go to. It's not there anymore. So, my ability to buy a house, gone, evaporated, unless I'm making 80, 90K a year and don't have 50 grand in credit card debt accumulated, from either school loans or other stuff along the way. So that has been frustrating to me. Is like, why don't people wake up and see that there is a group of people who are doing incredibly well in this world, and each year they get further and further ahead of the rest of us. Tying that into what you're saying about Ukraine, I guess I had that hope too, that it would cause more of us to be like, hey, this isn't a guarantee, right? Even what we do have here isn't guaranteed. Really short-lived experience we've had as a nation. And as a nation under these sort of conditions, for sure. But I don't know, it still doesn't seem that people are there. And I wonder, what is it going to take? I look at, maybe we can kind of bring it into a more domestic issue just a minute, although, it's all ties in, I think. We have an issue like housing and we have it, the evidence on the table. It says real estate and leasing creates more GDP per capita in this country than any other industry. That only happened after 2008, when it seems like we imported the bad practices around buy, renovate, refinance, process, flipping houses, people reading Rich Dad, Poor Dad, all of a sudden becoming investors to buy up cheap property, raise the rents, all that garbage, passive income bro stuff, I call it. But that has created an unlivable situation for any of us. And, we have more homeless in St. John here than we've ever had, keeps getting worse. But yet when it comes to transformative ideas or moving the needle, a lot of people show up to the meetings to say, well, I don't want this in my backyard. This hyper individualism is like, well, I recognize that crime's up. I recognize that there's chaos in the streets, but my house hasn't burned down yet. So damn you all, right? That loss of communitarianism. Like I said to somebody the other day, like 100 years ago, if you didn't show up for a barn raising, outside Harvey or whatever, 150 years ago, you weren't going to get looked after by the community, and you were probably not going to make it. Like it was a life or death thing that you had the good graces of the community and that you were a member of good standing, because when winter hit and you lost your barn to a fire, or you lost your food stores or whatever, you needed that community. We have this weird sense that we don't need each other anymore. And Yeah,
that's
it's
because we've been so successful, right? I mean,
right.
we've formalized and outsourced that communitarian core that is absolutely critical for holding groups of Homo sapiens together, because we are pack animals, and we've been so privileged that we've been able to kind of forget that we're pack animals living in the wealthy society that we are incredibly lucky to have been born into. But the reality is that those structures, again, need that radical overhaul that you're just describing. But the equal reality is that no one will do that until their back is up against a wall, because humans, in addition to being pack animals, are animals that respond to their lived environment. And we are growing increasingly fearful, because social media is exposing us to the visual images that have the most impact on our brain, that make us believe the world is falling apart, which is unfortunately also reasonably accurate at this point. And how much that is being driven by the perception, or whether events are driving perception or the other way around, doesn't really matter. The fact is that is happening. So we have these increasing levels of the sort of fear of the outside, plus the fact that we can avoid feeling that bad things are happening by further retreating behind those same screens. And so we are building walls rather than around communities that allow us to build walls together to raise barns and build houses. We're using them just to create these electronic barriers around ourselves where we no longer have to engage with people. So I think it again comes back to, there is going to need to be some radical changes. And they're going to annoy people on the left and the right. So talking about billionaires, first off, that similarly, I have no problem with people being rich. I have a problem with people being poor. Right. And that's, I think, a fundamental sort of mistake I think that the left has made over the decades, is being seen as being against ambition and success. But the point is not about stopping people from doing well. It's about making sure that everyone has the chance to do well, and that even the dumbest and laziest amongst us don't starve to death because of it, because the dumbest and laziest amongst us can have kids, and they deserve exactly the same chance at a good life as a incredibly energetic billionaire's kids. So, but at the same time, the billionaires have got a political problem right now. And we are seeing, ironically, states run entirely by billionaires talking about wealth divisions in Western democracies to create political divisions that are absolutely shredding our political fabric. Similarly, on the other side, so you have got talking about that breakdown of cultural solidarity. We have got public sector unions that make it impossible for large numbers of people to do lots of the things that we used to do to try and help our society out. And when I was education minister, it was nearly impossible to get families involved in many areas of school life because it crossed the borders of what unionized workers were supposed to be doing. And we would be accused of trying to undermine union rights if we had community activists and volunteers helping out in schools, because it was seen as a slippery slope that, well, here they're doing 1 hour of help in the library, but what happens if they do 3? And then eventually we're going to get rid of the librarians. And of course, there are some politicians who would want to get rid of the librarians. But so we've ended up by creating these silos where we have the very wealthy protecting their interests in the sort of the middle class context, the very wealthy being public sector unionists protecting their interests, everyone claiming they're actually doing things for great altruistic reasons that the rest of us who aren't billionaires or public sector workers look at and go, this is all kind of BS, right? Because to your point, things are getting less affordable for me. Great that you're talking about the wonders of a non-American public healthcare system, but not so great when I can't actually ever access it.
Yeah, I still don't have a doctor for me or my 4 kids, right? Like
that's terrible. Right? I mean, that's I've been doing a lot of talks at universities and high schools the last couple of years since I quit cabinet, partly because I'm just interested in hearing what people in a generation that I am not part of have to say. And one of the things that I find most interesting is that there's a division. On the one hand, a lot of people who are saying, we want to work together and have a better world, the sort of idealism that's traditionally being associated with younger voters. But on the other hand, saying, I don't want to pay 40% of my income in taxes for a healthcare system that I never get to see. And that's a hard, that's for someone who believes strongly in strong government programs that deliver results. That's a hard thing to push back against, because to your point, we're a bit older. I've got 20 years on you. We can look back to our youth and go, man, we used to be able to access this. I used to be able to go to this clinic. I used to have a doctor, They don't care about that. The fact that we used to have a system that worked well in no way connects to the fact that today that system is broken. Because I've been chatting with the new party on a bunch of people who are healthcare experts. And one of the things that keeps on coming up is saying that at some point, we have got to stop talking about the current structure of the Canadian healthcare system and get back to the core principle, which is, do we want to have a healthcare system that is free on point of delivery for Canadians?
Yeah.
And if we do, that's going to require some massive changes that are going to be upsetting to people on the left and the right, because neither of those paradigms work to deliver that public healthcare system that we've talked about and which we kind of used to have. It's not going to look like that. It's going to be new and different. But that would also make sense because there's been massive societal changes. When Tommy Douglas introduced Medicare in Canada, he made a point of saying he didn't want the government paying for people's aspirin. He wanted the government to make sure that no one ever had to choose between bankruptcy or losing their home and getting high quality care for their family.
Right.
And that was a point when doctors were the big driver of healthcare costs.
Yeah, and they fought Tommy Douglas tooth and nail.
Absolutely, but they had to, the irony, that Canadian socialized medicine was introduced with scab labor because Douglas brought in doctors from the public healthcare system in the UK as part of a deal with the Labour government in the UK to work as scab labor to replace the striking doctors in Saskatchewan. But but you look at the evolution from the 60s till today. Now the biggest cost driver is drugs. And drugs that we could not even have imagined would exist 20 years ago. Right. I've got moderate asthma. Until I was 15, there was no treatment at all. Now I don't even think about it. I take a puffer in the morning and a pill, and I'm totally fine to go and hang out with as many cats and dogs and other as I want to, which used to cause me to be miserable. But anyway, those drugs are expensive, and some of them are a hell of a lot more important to people's well-being than my asthma puffer. But they are hugely expensive. And so when we end up by living in a province and in a country where one of the biggest advantages or assets in getting a public sector job is access to private healthcare, what the hell does that show you about our system? And how separated from the original point have we become when the people who are working for the Department of Health, when it comes time for their unions to negotiate for them, one of the things they want to negotiate is better access to private health insurance. Yeah. It's bonkers, but we've just become used to it because we've lived in this very stable, successful society, and things have kind of grown and evolved over the decades. But until we go back to the brass tacks and say, okay, we've got these massive expanding costs in the healthcare sector, decreasing results, those have both got to be addressed. Spending more money in healthcare is not going to fix healthcare. If you want a good example of that, the Blair Brown government in the UK in I think it was 2002 or 3, a few years after they were elected, they were seeing the same struggles with the National Health Service. They put in the biggest ever investment in a government program anywhere in history. So it was a huge investment. And for the first couple of years, things got better. But then the system, because the system wasn't changed, it was just fed more, it absorbed that. And the money all disappeared into salaries and other things. And the results started to drop off. And that led late in the Blair government and through Brown's time to this, look, what can we do? And they never came up with the answer.
Well, and I think we're seeing that in Tim Houston's example, right? Like he pushed the envelope on that when that got him elected. And it does seem like there has been a notable improvement, but it's too early to tell whether that's going to be transformative for Nova Scotia.
Yeah, and part of the problem is that we continue, because we've lived in a comfortable society for a long time, not to look at, and this is where I'm more old school lefty, not to look at some fundamental things like class divisions, where it is bizarre that we believe that because people work inside a unionized office, that somehow they are representing the interests of the broader society. They're not supposed to anymore. Like that's the goal of unions to become part of a transformative social project was abandoned decades ago. We have unions acting in their sectoral interest to advance the cause of their members. When you're dealing with the public purse as being the source of funds, it's hard not to make really aggressive wage demands.
Right.
The doctors, the lawyers, the engineers, operating under the cover of professional associations that were created hundreds of years ago to protect the independence of expertise against, at that point, usually autocratic monarchies, have now morphed into special interest groups that, again, advocate for the interests of their members. Nothing wrong with that, except for we are spending so much on doctors' salaries for doctors who don't serve the public in the province. When we see the huge number of people who are who are living without doctors. And that's, I'm not making excuses for government, but that is not a government problem, except in as much as governments have refused to address the power of the professional associations and similar interest groups. But no one wants to do that because that involves a big political fight. And so we're continuing to see the doctors acting more and more like trade unions, the trade unions acting more and more like the professional associations in terms of both just becoming sectoral interest groups looking out for themselves with no real broad community vision at all. And I still remember a QP leader telling me that wage increases should be as high as the actuarial tables would allow without any regard to the public finances. And that's insane. That you can't, and it's one of the, you end up in private sector unions end up being much more reality based because they can see that if we draw too much in salaries, the company's going to go bust. And so you have countries that have handled private sector unionization well or better than Canada, where that works great. And the unions do their job of protecting workers' interests, pushing for wage increases, And
that's why I love workers' cooperatives, because they hit that piece a lot more sensibly, I think, than unions can. Not that unions aren't needed, but workers-owned cooperatives, they answer that in a different way.
They do, except for the problem with the co-ops is they require such a much higher level of engagement and activism and leadership from everyone. And I think one of the mistakes of co-op movements is sort of built on the mistakes of democratic politics, in which people like you and I might often have a tendency to think that there are more people like you and I out there.
Yeah, we're mutants.
And I think, and ultimately you don't want more people like you and I, right? Like you want humans again. I think we need to look at evolutionary imperatives sometimes a little bit more than we do, especially because we've learned so much more in the last 100 years about how humans and other animals behave. And we've done very little work to figure out how we integrate that in our politics. But you don't want to have a huge number of people going out trying to change things all the time, because otherwise everything falls apart. So
that's that Edmund. I think that's that Edmund Burke. Sorry to cut you off. This was that quote that always occurs to me when you say that, don't tear down a fence until you know why it was built. It's like I tend to try to just tear down fences. It's taken a lot of discipline, a lot of practice to learn. Okay, maybe not every fence,
And me too. And I think, that's where for me, I have, as I've grown older, and when I was younger, identified much more with a left tradition because I really admired the cultural drive, right? Like my grandma, my mother's family. Are from the coal mining community in the north of England, and that sort of history of people who were illiterate, fighting for their rights, working hard, not to overthrow a system, but to improve on the one that had oppressed them and to take it over. Seeing like coal miners become members of the Attlee cabinet in 1945 UK, things like that. That tradition of just regular people being able to fight for and win their rights in a context where everyone does better. I always found that hugely inspiring, and kept on looking and saying, okay, well, to your point, like, that doesn't make any sense. Why is that fence there? And recognizing as you get older that some of those things are there because evolution is better than revolution. And I think the success of Western democracies in terms of being the geographic locations where individual rights and collective rights have been defined, fought for, those rights won, and then expanded to a point that would seem unimaginable to anyone hearing us talk or looking at a Canadian newspaper from 100 years ago. Those are all things that are inspiring. But again, one of the other challenges we have is that we're now facing these huge, fragile, complicated structures. The fence is no longer the fence. The fence is now a nuclear power plant. The fence is a distributed information system that even the people who run it don't really understand.
That's right, yeah.
And so we're asking people who are not particularly well suited by evolution, human beings, to manage big, complex, delicate structures like this, and saying to people who have no exposure in running any of these things, in democracy, we want their voice has to be heard, saying, well, what do you think about this?
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why politicians have enjoyed having social media to fall back on, because you can avoid all those complicated questions about, we want to have, I believe human-caused climate change is real and is a crisis and has to be addressed. I'd be strongly on the side of saying nuclear power works. I don't care how much it costs. I don't care about a few Olympic-sized basement full worth of waste compared to the other technologies that are out there, because I believe it's a crisis. Others would argue against me on that. Those conversations that are going to end up by having need to be based on how much money is this going to cost? How much is it going to take away from money that we would spend elsewhere on the social programs that might cost more because of climate change impacting our communities with flooding, whatever. So these incredibly deep conversations with massive amounts of data.
Yep. A lot of nuance.
Yeah. So we're asking people who are tuning into politics for a few minutes a day to have a sensible opinion on this. while the politicians themselves, in many cases, have no idea how to engage intelligently in the conversation, because they were doing what you and I have both run for office.
Mm-hmm.
We both work with colleagues who, in some cases, are people you go, my God, I'd like to see this person be able to run much bigger things. And others gone, my God, I'm extremely terrified this person might get elected, right? So we've got this system, which it's Churchill's line about how democracy is the worst system except for all the others that have been tried from time to time. That's even more true in an incredibly complicated world like the one we have now. So how do we maintain democratic engagement in a way that's realistic given the limitations of our species? So that's, again, my concern about co-ops, is that often they're started by people like us, and then because we like breaking things down and building them up, we go off and do something else, and then we do incredibly complex structures for other folks who are not as interested. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. That's just different people are good at and interested in doing different things. Because we tend to, I think people who are more egalitarian in their outlook, which I would expect you and I would be pretty far along in that spectrum, have a tendency to think that people maybe are more the same across a whole range of different personality traits and aptitudes. And that often is what trips us up.
Yeah, no, it's true. No, it's good. That's a good range there. It's a good point. There is a couple of questions. I want to respect the time. We set an hour aside. There's a couple of questions I want to just fire off around this election, because there is a long conversation. I think we should revisit this sort of, how do we fix the woes of a generational problem around democracy that we're having with its technologies and its disruptions, which I think is a good conversation. But with this election specifically, there's a perception out there that things are going to, well, I guess I've heard a couple of things. One, I've heard from some people who will say, this is the time for a third party like the Greens to make a breakthrough. And, they've never been in a better position, or a third party like them has never been in a better position to kind of push the envelope to a point where the status quo parties who have just shared power have to change their practices in order to properly compete and in order to properly represent the public. And there's people who are hopeful about that. And then there's people who will say, no, everybody's just so frustrated with Blaine. It's going to be a Susan Holt victory. You've got some, you've obviously got a thermostat on some of this. Like, where do you think the province is right now when it comes to this election cycle?
I would guess it'll be more towards the latter. And I think that's because parties don't really exist anymore. Like the PC party of Blaine Higgs is not the PC party of Bernard Lord. In either the version that I was happy to serve under for a couple of years and then increasingly unhappy for a couple of years. That it was my last statement in the legislature on the last day. It happened to be the 25th anniversary of the election of the Bernard Lord government. And I got up and they had forgotten on the Tory side, and there was no statement. So I got up and made a statement saying that it was great that, noting this day when a PC government that brought down divisions between English and French New Brunswickers, and I made a couple of fairly points about it. But you could watch the Tories, some of whom had served under Bernard Lord, clapping, but then seeing the Premier wasn't clapping, and Chris Austin wasn't clapping, and wondering whether they should clap. And then the Liberals are clapping, and the Greens were clapping. So you've got 2.5 parties in the House applauding the government party for its go election success, but with the leader of the government and a number of other folks refusing to participate in that. And so parties are now defined by leaders. That I'm going to vote for Susan Holt in the fall. She's running in my constituency. I would never in a million years have voted for Brian Gallant. I thought he was many of the bad traits of Premier Higgs amplified several times over. I think he would have been a disaster if he'd been running our province during COVID, for example. So leadership doesn't matter very much. Leadership matters a lot. Parties don't matter very much anymore. The reality is, going into this election, that the Greens have not yet built on the initial success that David Kuhn brought to the party with getting himself and 2 colleagues elected, that they've got some good candidates, but not enough to have that appearance of being prepared for a breakthrough. And having, there was a CBC piece up yesterday about my long ago NDP project and the range of people I brought together. And that was seen as being very close to a breakthrough, which didn't work. And I don't see David being able to move much further than that at this point. At the same time, campaigns can always upend things, so not to write him or his team off.
Right.
But I would guess that that it will end up being a Blaine Higgs PC party up against a Susan Holt Liberal Party, which includes a lot of the people who supported Blaine Higgs in 2018. Including a bunch of former and currently elected progressive conservatives, and a lot of activists across the country who were people who helped me on my campaigns here in Fredericton, West Hamwell, and helped the PCs across the province, because I've heard a former minister say that she'll be voting Liberal in the fall, and then the next day work to take her party back, the PCs back. So
Right.
I would guess it's going to end up being a "do you like Blaine Higgs or not" alternative, and I would guess that will not advantage the Greens. It certainly won't help. The NDP is functionally irrelevant, and I gather we have a new Libertarian Party. But
I know, I see that. I don't know what the heck that's about. Cool.
That'll be 5 guys who will all have their own platforms, presumably. I always enjoy the idea.
That's right. I know. I always we've done this on the podcast. Yeah, we've done this.
That'll be my guess. I would think it'll be a Susan versus Blaine battle, and my hope, because I believe in human rights and equality, and also balancing budgets and delivering programs, I hope that Susan Holt wins, because I think she's better. That's, I know both of them, and can give my endorsement based on having known both of them for 14 years.
Okay. Now, final question. You're not reoffering. Is that
correct?
We know that's true. Do you intend to run in New Brunswick when the next federal election comes up?
That's certainly the expectation, I think, at this point. One of the biggest challenges is, which gets back to, sort of ties into our conversations around mature democracies and how things don't work, is that if you're trying to start up a new political party, which is an interesting challenge in itself that maybe we can talk about some other time.
Yeah.
It's the fact that it took Elections Canada 6 months to approve my party's application process is something that I'm not particularly pleased about. And the reality is that if you live in New Brunswick, that it costs, as I'm sure you know, thousands of dollars to get around the country, to get to any place where you can get to any other place. And one of the biggest impediments, not being a party that's wealthy, a party that's brand new, doesn't have established networks of donors in the form of bankers or trade unions or anything else, relying on small donations, is the cost of moving me around out of New Brunswick is many times more than it would be if I was based in Ottawa, Toronto, or Montreal.
Right.
And so there's an interesting, just straight up logistical challenge about running a shoestring party from a periphery in the country. And so it'd certainly be my hope. That's where I live, it's where I'm from, grew up here, and I love my province, and obviously I've got elected here. So that would make, it would certainly make some sense to build on the constituency I have. We did a poll the other month, and even though we haven't done any work to publicize the name of the party, the Canadian Party was pushing into double digits in Atlantic Canada.
Okay.
Just a reflection of the fact that this is a part of the country that doesn't like extremism very much, because we're just that way, which I like. But also the fact that I've got a constituency for the sort of the political messages that I brought over the years, which have hopefully been fairly consistent, despite the fact that the party colors I've flown under have changed from time to time.
Yeah, well, that pragmatism definitely shines through. I really appreciate your time, Dominic, for just coming in. There's definitely some more topics we'll have to circle back to, but I think it's great for people as we enter into this election, just to be thinking about some more things critically, and to kind of have that perspective that you bring from your experience in government and trying to start something new for government. So again, thank you for all you're doing.